Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint a couple of fuzzy bumblebees on flowers. This was a request by Diana, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I really love this idea because it's such a simple scene and I feel like it's a scene that I can practice to paint in a loose manner. These are the two references that I combined for this painting. I find that this just helps me figure out where to place the bees, and I really like the type of flower on the first image, so I'll just create a very loose interpretation of these two images. I like to start by roughly sketching the guidelines very lightly and loosely, and since the bumblebees will be the focal points, I want to make sure that they're positioned correctly within the frame. As for the rest of the flowers, I feel like I'm comfortable enough to paint them freehand, but if it's doable to create an outline for this, which I'll try, I'll have it in my coffee shop. To simplify the bees, sometimes I like to divide them into three sections, the head, midsection, and the bottom, with the head being the smallest, midsection being rounder, and the bottom more oval. Or you can also simplify the shape by drawing a bean-like structure as well. That might be simpler for some of you. Since they're quite chubby, with this I find it much easier to paint the fuzz around the structure. I also want to indicate the placement of the wings to make sure I can paint around them, and also where the legs are interacting with the flowers, including the antennas. For the colors, I'll be using Lamp Black by Daniel Smith, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Holbein, Terre Verte by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, and Compost Blue by Holbein. I'm going to start by painting some flowers surrounding the bees, and I want these to be somewhat out of focus, so I'm starting by using a wet on wet technique by dampening the surface of the areas where I want to place these flowers. The water doesn't have to be placed neatly, and I want it to spread a bit larger than the actual flowers themselves, so when I apply the paint it'll have more space to travel. In terms of the color, I used Hansa Yellow as the main color, then I added a touch of vermilion to add a bit of warmth to the yellow. On the damp surface, I like to paint the flower petals very loosely, leaving a bit of space for the larger green sepals. And when painting these flowers, I want to imagine if they're going to be seen from the side or if they're slightly leaning forward. I like to mix and match the angles for a natural looking composition. For the sepal, I'm using a mix of Terre Verte with a little bit of sepia to mute the color. Sometimes when the surface is too wet, as I apply the paint, it'll somewhat disperse uncontrollably. Personally, I don't mind this at all because due to the damp surface, the pigment that I apply will spread and it'll dry way lighter than what I've originally placed. So we can always paint over it with a thicker consistency, and I also quite like the randomized texture it creates. I find that this just enhances the dynamic of the painting. Now that I've painted a few flowers, I'm going to add the green stems as well as the sepals if we can see it from the side view of the flower. Once I'm done, I'm going to leave these flowers for now and move on to paint the flowers under the bumblebees. I want this part of the painting to be in focus, so I'm going to paint straight on the dry paper starting with the same yellow. For this one, I want to show the flower from the side, so we can see the petals are painted on a flatter area, and there will be foreshortened petals in the middle. For the next one, I really like how the flower look on the reference, so I like to recreate something similar. Instead of painting the petals straight to the center, this time I've left out a small oval to indicate the center of the flower that is slightly leaning forward compared to the previous flower. Then since I realized that the flower from the first bumblebee to the second is placed quite far apart, I'm going to add another filler flower to fill in the space on the right hand side. And to paint that area, I'm going to use the same method as before by dampening the surface before painting on the petals. I feel like I have a pretty good base, so now I'm going to make sure everything's completely dry and move on to paint the second layer on the filler flowers, or the flowers which are out of focus. I'm going to use a more orangey tone, so this has more vermilion in the mix, and I also added a little bit of the green mixture from the sepals and the stem, just to mute the color slightly, so it's not overly saturated. Because the previous layer was painted on the damp surface, the placement of the flower isn't too accurate, so with this layer, I'm going to paint with a little bit more accuracy. I'm just going to leave the first flower for now and move on to a second one because I feel like the paint needs to settle a bit. Then I'm going to go back and use a more orangey tone with more vermilion in the mixture to paint in the center. When I'm painting these flowers, I want things to look textured and uneven, which is why I tend to like doing smaller brush strokes instead of one big swoop. I like to go back and forth on these filler flowers and add the details little by little. I do this so I give them time to dry bit by bit, and after painting the main petals, I like using a darker orange color that is slightly muted by a touch of Terre, Verte, and Sepia to add a bit more definition around some of the petals, and also to add volume to the sides of the very tiny petals at the center. I like to also neaten out the sepals. I felt like the first layer was a bit too muted from the sepia, so I'm just going to layer with a lot more Terre Verde in the ratio. And I also added a bit of the orange colors from the flowers to brighten up the green slightly. This also helps bring more consistency to the colors of this whole painting. Right at the very center, there's this dense collection of small petals, and you can see in the reference that the middle has younger petals in this lime green color. And for this, I'm just going to use the same greens as the sepals, but with added Hansa yellow and a touch of vermilion, and I just lightly dot it in where the center is visible. I also focus on separating the longer petals and the younger petals. I actually just treat the younger petals as one big group and use vermilion with a touch of Hansa yellow to paint the sides facing us. When I'm painting on these features, I like to layer little by little on a lightly damp surface, so the paint application is slightly blurry and a bit inaccurate, but as I layer on more details, I will gradually work with more accuracy with a darker value. I find that this contrast in the sharpness helps loosen up the painting, creating something that looks more organic rather than something that is fully controlled. Once I feel like there's a good enough density to these light flower petals, I sometimes like to add additional loose ones with a bit more vermilion in the mix, just for a slightly darker value. And I add random thin ones as contrasting accents, and to also bring a bit more of a delicate feel to these flowers. I'm pretty happy with the filler flowers for now, so I'm going to move on to paint the bumblebees. I start by painting the wings with a medium to light consistency of buff titanium, and I like to paint it first so it's easier for me to paint around it when I'm painting the body. Now let's paint the fuzz. I'm using Hansa yellow with again the tiniest bit of vermilion to paint the yellow parts of the fuzz, and I like to create short hair strokes with a medium consistency and with my smallest brush. This way I don't accidentally pick up too much water and paint, so the texture will look sharper. Once I've painted the yellow parts, I'm going to use a medium consistency of lamp black to paint in between while creating the same type of texture. From the references that I've seen so far, generally they have two yellow parts and the head will always be black and the bottom will also be black, but right at the tip of the bum, I think that's maybe where the stingers are. Sometimes you can see some white fuzz. These are just according to some of the pictures I've seen, but please feel free to correct me in the comments. Most of the time though, the white fuzz is not visible, so I guess you don't have to paint them on for every single bee that you add. Once I'm done with the first layer, I like to go back in with a slightly thicker consistency of lamp black. And I paint it in a similar manner, but only for the bottom part. This will just add more of a three-dimensionality. I'm also going to do the same for the yellow parts, but for the yellow I would add more vermilion in the mix as well and a slightly thicker consistency. For the legs, I kind of want to paint it in between the flowers. The first one on the left is a bit odd because I had a bit too much water in my bristles, but I'm just going to leave it as is. As for the detail of the wings, I'm going to line one side with lamp black with a light brush load. Then I added some orange mixture, painting with a lighter consistency, and a dry brush load for the veins and details of the wings. Once I'm done, I'm going to repeat the same steps to paint the second bumblebee, but I'm going to add more detail to the flower petals first, so it's easier for me to visualize where the placement of the legs should be as they're interacting with each other. As I was painting the petals, I felt like this looks too stiff compared to everything else, so I just used a clean damp brush to pull some paint outwards and use the residual paint that I picked up with my bristles to spread it in other areas as well. Now again, I'm going to paint the fuzz. I find that by dividing the sketch into 3 sections for the bumblebee, it's a little bit easier for me to know where each part end and start. And as for the fuzz, I also like to direct the brush strokes according to the form of the body. For this one, since we can see the back of the bee a little bit more, I'm just going to pull a bit of that black downwards and mix in a bit of buff titanium to add that additional white fuzz. Just like the flowers, as I'm creating those small brush strokes, it's okay to leave some white negative space. In fact, I find that this gives more of an airiness to the overall painting without making any element look too bulky. Before adding the legs on the bumblebee, I'm going to define the flower and add a bit more detail, especially for the area where there are small petals. I'm going to paint small vertical lines going around an oval, and I made these lines smaller and thinner at the back, and since we can see the center pretty well, I also added some of the lime green in the middle. At this point, looking at the painting, I wasn't sure how dense I wanted the filler flowers to look, so I also added some splatters to add more dynamic to the painting, and I don't mind since I just used the yellow, which is fairly light anyway. But after adding on those splatters, I'm going to continue back to paint the details on the wings, and I'm just using the same method by lining one side of the wing using lamp black, and then I use a mix of lamp black with a bit of orange in a light consistency and a dry brush load for the veins. Still with the same muted reddish orange mix, and with my small brush, I'm going to add more detail to the small petals at the center of the flowers, adding some very small fine details to neaten up the painting. At this point, I feel pretty happy with the painting, but I still want to fill in the space with some leaves. I'm also going to add some damp patches with a really light consistency of yellow. And this is just to fill in some of the space a bit more and also to add some really distant flowers in the back. As for the leaves, I kind of wish I approached this the same way as how I've painted the flowers, which is to kind of paint on more of a damp surface and just let the paint travel on its own to look more organic. Sadly, I didn't think of this before, so I just tried to replicate some looseness by first painting the actual shape of the leaves, then adding water in some random areas and even dabbing excess water off with tissue to make certain areas look a bit more blurred. After adding the leaves though, I feel like the spacing looks a bit too stiff in general. This is my fault. I think I've spaced everything out too evenly, so I just try to increase the density of elements, especially near the bottom, by adding even more leaves in random spots, and I tried smudging them just for the sake of darkening certain areas. I feel pretty happy with how the flower at the top looks, so now I'm going to add the smaller details on the bumblebee, adding the antennas as well as the legs. I'm not really sure of the structure, but I just followed the reference image to see how many connections they have, and I just use a thick consistency of lamp black for this. Now going back to the flowers, I feel like I'm losing the focal point because all the flowers here are quite bright and saturated. So I'm going to mute and darken some areas at the bottom. I tried to mute some flower petals for the ones at the bottom, and I also try adding more muted orange flowers at the back behind the ones that I've already painted. And for the ones at the back, I just dampen the surface randomly, then paint on the flower petals using the muted orange mix. Looking at the image as a whole again, now I feel like there's too much of the orange yellow, so I wanted to introduce a complementary color, which is blue, to offset the warmth of the flowers. I started by dampening the surface, and I'm going to just tap my brush lightly with a thin to medium consistency of composed blue, and while doing this, I'm going to be very careful as I paint around some of the flower petals, making sure I don't paint over it so I don't lose the nice contrast between these two colors next to each other. I'm going to add some blue splatters to fill the space on the top left corner. Then I'm just going to balance everything out. This includes the details as well as the values around the painting. I personally feel I need to darken some of the stems, so I'm sticking with my small brush and I'm using a medium to thick consistency of the muted green to redefine some of these stems so they can stand out against the brighter flowers. At the bottom, where I can't paint the blue because there will be no sky, I decided to do a light wash with the muted dark green in between the flowers to reduce the large white spots. One more addition of flower behind the bee, and that's basically it for this painting. I'm always happy to be able to practice with these loose style. Thank you so much for suggesting to paint this subject matter, and I hope you learned something new. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!